afternoon to most, good morning still to some. And if you are joining us from outside of the United States, we welcome you and bid you whatever time of day it is where you reside. My name is Ulysses Burley, and I serve as chair of the United States HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition, which is hosting this conversation in partnership with the International Conference on Stigma. The United States HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition is composed of people of faith, faith leaders, people living with HIV, and people working in the HIV and AIDS response to develop and implement strategies to strengthen the role of faith communities toward ending the HIV epidemic. We are a coalition of more than 300 faith leaders nationwide. We are people living with HIV. We are allies. We are same gender loving and trans and non-binary. We are Black, white, and brown, and we are Americans. And I feel the need to emphasize the fact that we are Americans at this current moment in our country. As people of faith, we recognize that faith communities have historically contributed to the stigma that emanates as it relates to people living with HIV and the demographics of people who are disproportionately impacted by HIV. And the U.S. HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition is a coalition of leaders who are determined to change the narrative. We want to be a part of the solution, and we feel like we are well positioned to do so because faith communities have so often been a part of the problem. And so today we are pleased to host a conversation around faith to end HIV criminalization, because we believe that HIV criminalization is a direct consequence of HIV stigma. We currently exist in an environment where people no longer are dying from HIV. People are living and thriving, but people are still impacted and are still dying from stigma and HIV-related stigma, and stigma that criminalizes a medical diagnosis, and stigma that criminalizes certain identities. And so we are pleased to offer a dynamic conversation with experts, people of lived experience, who will talk about the ways in which faith communities and communities at large can play a role in decriminalizing HIV, but also to humanize people who are living with HIV and people who are most impacted by HIV. And so it's my pleasure to invite my sibling, my colleague, my friend, Dr. Raja Bhattar, who will moderate our conversation today. Dr. Bhattar, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Burley. Good afternoon, good morning, welcome, namaskar, buenos dias, buenas tardes, hafa day. Greetings to everyone from wherever you are. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us at this really important conversation. I feel super honored that Ulysses asked me to be a part of this space and to guide this conversation with four really incredible pillars in this work. We've been doing this work in quite a few different ways. And so before we get started, I wanted to just ask you all to take a deep breath with me as we engage this conversation. Go ahead and breathe in and breathe out. In my tradition as a Hindu Buddhist, I believe that breathing is one of the most critical things that we have as a gift and tool for our healing. And so as we do so, I wanted to make sure we offer that. I'm also really excited to honor and welcome our four panelists to the conversation. We can go ahead and come onto camera. I will share a little bit about each of you as well. But I think as we think about this conversation, stigma and HIV and faith are so deeply rooted. I think about the law, some of the laws that we have now work started in the 80s and 90s that still impact people who are living with HIV and stigmatize their ability to exist as humans and often criminalize their existence simply because of who they are, even when we have had incredible medical technologies that have helped people, as Ulysses said, live and also prevent transmission, etc. Um, Along with that, in our U.S. context, 1 in 7 people who are living with HIV don't know their status, and so how is that contributed to by the stigma, by some of the different faith spaces that we hold and engage? And at the same time, there was also a survey by the Kaiser Foundation in 2019 that 1 in 5 Americans still report that they would not feel comfortable working with a person if they knew they were HIV positive. Again, um, the amount of fear and scare tactics that are impacting folks are really interesting, right? And scary. And then thinking about the fact that while we have PrEP and PEP and DoxyPEP and all these other various forms of prevention, there's still lots of fear, even with serodiscordant relationships with people who are HIV positive and people who are HIV negative, given the low risk of HIV transmission. If we think about faith and religion and the ways that faith is often both, as one of our speakers was saying at our pre-call, can be a tool for liberation, but also has been a tool for harm for many people. So that's why I think this conversation feels so critical of how do we complicate these narratives that kind of the larger media portrays, and how do we as folks who hold these complex identities and perspectives engage in why we are committed to this work. So I'm really honored to excited and welcome in folks. I'll start with Jada. Jada Hicks is the Senior Positive Justice Project Attorney. She uses she, her pronouns. She earned her Juris Doctor from North Carolina Central University School of Law. While at NCCU, she was certified in Civil Rights and Constitutional Law. She received her bachelor's in criminology from North Carolina State University. And prior to joining the CHLP, she served as an inaugural judicial fellow for the administrative of the courts. While there, she provided independent and confidential legal research and writing to support to more than 370 judges in North Carolina Superior and District Courts. Previously, Jada has worked as an assistant district attorney for the Pitt County District Attorney's Office, and she has prosecuted cases ranging from drug offenses to DWIs. Welcome, Jada. I'm going to introduce all the panelists, and I'll give some time for them to add in some coloring to their own personal perspectives. Our second panelist is going to be Jasmine Tasaki. Jasmine Tasaki is a staunch advocate and community organizer for transgender women and issues affecting trans rights, health, and housing. Through her work, intersectionality has become very important to her. Jasmine has worked as a PrEP navigator, an HIV counselor, sexual health educator, and cultural competency facilitator for the Memphis Police Department. She was also the first leader of trans experience in the Memphis Urban League of Young Professionals, with health literacy and advocacy chairperson, and an ambassador for the Black AIDS Institute. Ms. Tasaki is the founder and executive director of the first trans-led organization, We Care Tennessee in Memphis. Ms. Tasaki is also the co-managing executive director at Black and Pink, one of the only organizations of its kind. Welcome, Jasmine. Thank you for being here. Our third panelist is Lauren Whitney. In 2020, Lauren Whitney made a video in the wake of George Floyd's murder, daring the world to question stigmas on Black male bodies. This video, Ask Yourself, went viral, reaching millions of people around the world. In spring of 2021, Lauren launched Authentic Voices Global Incorporated, a platform built on storytelling, community, and social change. She is the proud graduate of Howard University with a Bachelor's in Fine Arts and the California Institute of the Arts with an MFA. She quotes, "I am a woman, a Black woman. I am a mother, a Black mother to my Black boy. My life is dedicated to bringing change today to shape a better and brighter tomorrow. Our breath depends on it." Welcome, Lauren. And finally, and definitely not last but not least, is Robert Suttle. Robert is a recognized HIV racial justice leader with over 10 years of standing in the gap for the HIV movement before the US criminalization system, cultivating relationships with other cross-movement leaders, collectively advocating for meaningful involvement of communities most impacted, centering Black communities and communities of color, connecting advocacy to decriminalize HIV to other movements around prisons, policing, and criminalization. Robert is a leading national advocate with the distinction of being perhaps the first person of HIV anywhere in the world who was prosecuted for an HIV crime and went public to raise awareness and mobilize advocacy for change. Robert served as an advisor on the HIV Justice Network Global Advisory Panel, and he has been living with HIV for 17 years. Please take a moment to honor and welcome our four incredible panelists to this space. Thank you so much. Welcome. So I wanted to get us started. I'm going to start with Jada, Lauren, Robert, and Jasmine. I'll change it, sorry, Jasmine, then Robert. But to tell us a little bit more about your work and how you connect this topic of faith, HIV, and criminalization and stigma. I'll start with Jada.
Yes, so I head our Positive Justice Project work, PJP, at the Center for HIV Law and Policy. So it's a campaign to end the criminalization of HIV and other stigmatized health conditions. And in doing that work, what I found was, especially in the South, the community and the communities that we are involved in and the communities that we love can sometimes hinder our progress. And we were seeing that particularly in the South. And so we have been brainstorming, like, how do we combat the stigma that we're seeing when we're approaching doing reform, or we're approaching how we combat stigma surrounding HIV. And one of the ways that we've decided to try and adjust that is by partnering with faith communities and faith leaders to try and get the message out about HIV, the realities of living with HIV and why it should not be stigmatized, and how faith leaders can either be agents of change within their communities, or they can feed into the stigma that already exists surrounding HIV. So really trying to partner with different faith leaders to tackle the stigma surrounding HIV.
Thank you so much, Jada. Really excited to learn more about the project. Lauren, share us a little bit more about your work and how you connect to this topic.
Well, first off, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to sit on this panel with such amazing individuals. Let me start with faith. Faith is a part of my life every single day. I think being a woman and being in a Black body, I must walk with faith. I don't know how we make it day to day without some form of faith. What brings me to this work specifically around criminalization of HIV and destigmatizing HIV? I am a storyteller, and my work began years ago on the stage and in front of the camera. And I realized that often the narratives that were being perpetuated as an actor, I wasn't interested in. I didn't want to play another character that perpetuated this negative image of Black women, or I saw the same thing with Black men. And really, what happened was when I made that video around the threat of the Black male body, what I realized is that story is incredibly powerful, and it's actually one of our greatest tools of education. And so when we talk about stigma and what drives stigma, it is a lack of education and understanding about a topic. So it's one operating from a place of ignorance, and then perpetuating a story or a narrative that they believe to be true, or has been told is true. And I just want to add this. Now more than ever, the stories that are being told hold such grave weight. And when we talk about the stigma of HIV, the stigma that's attached to it, we have narratives that are being told that HIV doesn't really exist in the way that it exists, or that HIV is not connected to AIDS, or just all these false narratives. And we're talking at very high levels in this society. And so I believe the way that we change things is that we have to take a hold of the narrative, and it matters who is shaping those narratives. And so as a storyteller, I come not to share from my lens of what I know, but I come as a learner, a lifelong learner. And I'm here to learn from those who have lived experience. And then I'm here to bring amplification to those stories so that we can reach those who don't know, but they have the tools and they can be equipped to really access that liberation.
Thank you. That was really beautiful and a great add-on to kind of Jada's framing of how we think about this work at a policy level, but also this personal level, but then also how we actually tell those stories makes a difference, and who and where we get access to it, and how we actually take up space. And we'll get to that a little bit as well. I'd love to invite Jasmine in to tell us a little bit more about your work and how you bring your perspective to this topic.
You know, I hate that I have to introduce myself because I want to go directly into piggybacking off what Lauren said. So I'm going to do that so I don't forget. And Lauren and Jada, you guys are making this conversation already. I'm like, oh my God, I'm loving this. Okay, so I just want to say that yes, right. Stigma is perpetuated through storytelling. And oftentimes, I was at an event yesterday and someone was sharing their story and they said something that may be true for them, but I also was really sitting in like, how does that impact others, right? And especially when we're talking about things that we view as right or wrong, you know, and when we make these statements through stories, they have impact on other people and how they view themselves, right? Because of how they want to be aligned with what's right and what's wrong. And as Black people specifically, we have power and connection through our storytelling. So there is a need for us to have stories to tell. And there's a need for the messages to be specific to us so that we can understand them. But there's also a need for there to be relevant, um, um, careful intentions behind those messages. And I think that's where things get messy when it comes to HIV and faith spaces and how people really communicate what it is they feel versus what the experience is, right? Because most people with lived experience do not feel safe enough to come into a faith space and bring that lived experience because of those who do not know, right? Like Lauren said, there's a level of ignorance for those who don't know what HIV is about or how it is acquired or what it's like to live with HIV. Those people creating their opinions and creating stories and it being perpetuated, they think that it's what we inherently do as Black people, right? And it's just sharing knowledge, but this when it's not true, it becomes stigma. So I wanted to give that piece. Hey everybody, hey y'all. I'm Jasmine Tasaki. I'm founder and executive director of We Care Tennessee in Memphis, Tennessee. What brought me to the work was just a journey of lived experience along with like friends and family and communities for many years being impacted by HIV, and also what that looked like for my community when it comes to how we exist in the intersection of HIV and faith. I think it's really important. I think that the work that we do in faith spaces often is not measured or quantified because we're not always doing it out of grant funding. It's more things that we're doing from the heart. It's more led by what some may call the anointing or your Black girl magic, whatever you want to call it, right? But you don't, you know, we often don't tie it to the work that we do that we get grants for. So it's really hard for people to really measure, you know, what it is that is faith and what it is that is just like being a good person, right? And how does faith and being a good person align? So those questions and those gaps always bring me to a space to really help my community sit in the questions of what do they want to practice? How does faith look for them? What does spirituality mean to them? And really having those conversations within themselves is something that women, not just trans women, but women often do not have the opportunity to have because we've been given Christianity as our practice. And for some people like myself who I do practice Christianity, but all Christians don't understand that there are many ways to practice spirituality and faith, and not acknowledging those other practices sometimes keeps people boxed in and hinders them from really discovering who they are. So that's why I'm here today for us to do a little bit more exploring. Thank you.
Love that introduction. Thank you, Jasmine. And I'm always a rule breaker, so I love the fact that you were like, we're just going to engage and start conversing because that's part of the what we're creating here. Robert, would you share a little bit more about your work and how you show up in this space today?
Yeah, I show up in this space pretty much like Jasmine mentioned about lived experience. I was prosecuted in 2009 in the state of Louisiana for intentional exposure to the AIDS virus. And so that experience changed my whole life. up to this point. I've been living with HIV for 21 years. Now, I know in the bio you said 17, but it's 21 years, and 15 of those years have been with addressing the criminalization experience that I've had. And so since that experience, I co-founded the Zero Projects organization in 2012 to represent the voice, the people who've actually been impacted by HIV criminalization specifically in various states. And so through that organization, I helped to bring awareness, putting a face to this issue and showing people who are impacted. And it's not, it's so that people can see it's just regular people that look like us on this panel at the moment, and probably those that are listening in. It's not just someone who is a career criminal, if you will. And so it has been very surprising to me that someone can be criminalized based on their health status, and that everything to address this issue has been around punishment. And so I'm just over the decade of my advocacy, I've just discovered that just all these things that are just wrong with the narrative that's out there. And so it's so important for me to have opened my mouth to speak up, because otherwise, there's a colleague who wrote a book called Criminalized Lives, HIV and Legal Violence, Alexander McClellan. And in it, he talks about how do we know what we know about HIV criminalization? And most of it's been through media, been through law enforcement, been through legislators, people who know nothing about living with HIV, people who are probably not Black and brown. And so a lot of the responses to HIV have been through those particular lens. And so it's so important that people like me and others who've experienced criminalization to speak out, because our narrative, our voices need to be heard. And so that is why I do what I do. And I'm so glad that I did not keep my mouth closed, because otherwise the court, the law enforcement, everyone else gets to say what they think about me. They get to describe me. And so in this movement, I've been able to define myself, and hopefully to be able to encourage other people to see themselves and see how they're at risk, or how they've been targeted or in danger, because I had no idea. I had no idea I was at risk for HIV. I had no idea about HIV criminalization laws. Like, it's just like I just walked right into these things. And so I'm so glad we have this panel today, because I feel like all of our experiences personally and professionally connect. And so I'm glad that hopefully we can, paint the picture here so that people can see this issue in a more deeper and meaningful way.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing your story and being brave enough to come out when you did, right? And to be able to take up space. I think so often, as you said, storytelling is not just what the story is, but who gets to tell it and who it reaches, and how it gets retold. And so I think what I'm hearing from all of us is the storytelling piece is so critical, and where the intentionality behind where we tell stories, why we tell stories, who gets to tell stories, whose stories matter in this space, whose stories get recorded, whose stories get retold, whose stories become canonical, if you will, get in the ways we think about these perspectives, and what perspectives often get forgotten because it doesn't serve a larger system that is here to harm people that look like many of us that are in the room. And so that power of holding space, I appreciate how all of you added a different shade to that lens of the conversation. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about stigma, and thinking about the fact that in 34 states in the US right now, there are at least 34, there's some type of law that criminalizes HIV. And Jada, you can probably speak to a little bit more than I can. But thinking about the way that stigma shows up in the criminalization, I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of what does that actually look like in some of these different practices and policies? And then also, how do you see the faith communities kind of being part of that conversation?
It's funny because when I think about like HIV criminal laws, I'm like, gosh, every aspect of it is just intertwined with stigma. Starting with the fact, I did start early as a prosecutor, and when I came and started working in HIV law and policy, what I noticed was the laws were written in a very different way than what you usually see. So usually in a law, you have some sort of intent to harm. The person has to have an intent to harm someone. And that's actually an element of the offense. For HIV criminal laws, you do not have that. There doesn't have to be an intent to harm. There doesn't have to be an intent to transmit. You don't even have to engage in activity that can transmit. You're still going to face prosecution. And so I think where we see the stigma is really just in that we haven't updated any of the laws in a really long time. Of course, there are a few states that have made progress, but the vast majority of the states that criminalize HIV, if they have updated their laws, it's been in a negative way. And so we see legislators on the floor talking about people who intentionally infect others with HIV, which to me is already a stigmatizing narrative that really is just unlikely. Like that's not what's happening, and that's how they try and frame the issue. So not only is when we're talking about storytelling can take place in many shapes and forms. One way that storytelling can take place, and one form of storytelling, is on the legislative floor, when legislators are shaping the narrative around who is facing criminalization and why. And so they are trying to frame it as it's always someone that's intentionally, their words, infecting someone with HIV. And that is not what's happening. And in fact, to pick on Louisiana for a moment, because we have Robert on the phone, part of their statute is any means of contact, you can face criminalization. So it's a very broad spectrum. They're trying to make sure that the law captures as many people as possible with the way that it is written right now. And what we know from data that the Williams Institute has collected is that is majority of Black and Brown communities are bearing the brunt of those prosecutions. So I just wanted to kind of weave in the storytelling aspect, that it's not just about like traditional storytelling that you would think of, that lawyers, that legislators, assembly members, they all engage in storytelling as well. They just do it in a much different way. And so I think stigma is really the root of HIV criminal laws. We don't want to talk about the fact that you can't transmit when you spit. Right? Like that's not a known means of transmission. You're not going to transmit when you bite. Yet we're still seeing people that are prosecuted for that. And also that like they don't want people with HIV to have healthy sex lives. They really don't. In Ohio, you can be prosecuted for sharing sex toys. You know what I mean? Like, so it's just a broad range of activity. And I think the reason that is because there is this misinformation and narrative that people living with HIV are vectors of disease, and they're not. And we are seeing that reinforced in the written law. And so I think there was a second part to your question. I hope that answered all of it. I'll stop there so that the other panelists can expand upon that.
No, you did. No, that was great. That was really interesting to think about. Again, we talked about how intention doesn't matter, right? The intention to harm doesn't matter in the Louisiana law. And yet the intention of these policymakers is to create systems where particularly Black and Brown folks are harmed, because we know, particularly in the South, the brunt of HIV epidemic is faced and impacting Black and Brown communities. And so then, similar to thinking about minimum wage laws or all these different policies that seem like they're just policies for the greater good, are actually intended to harm us at the intersectional level, right? Which feels powerful. I'm going to pick on Jasmine to come in, because you talked a little about faith earlier, and I appreciate your preaching, Jasmine, and thinking about how do you think this kind of this narrative that's being built by these policymakers and practitioners that is intentionally harming communities that look like us, particularly as a person of trans experience. How does that kind of feel, if it does, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, does it feel expounded upon because of kind of that additional trans, Black, queer experience, or how does that impact, and then how does religion and faith either add to or harm that conversation? Hopefully that makes
Yeah, I've been taking a lot of notes because like I have a lot of thoughts. So like I'm looking away from the camera and I'm very old school. I'm writing them down. So I'll say first, the narrative that's created is really dangerous. And it is, so it's white supremacy implemented by Black people. Oftentimes, the stories of stigma that are woven through the community come from community. They don't, so policymakers, your elected officials, your mayors are not sitting in community creating the stigma, right? They're creating the policies that enable the stigma, that enact the stigma, right? What perpetuates the stigma are the people in the community that are afraid of new information. And then how that stigma is perpetuated is done in pockets. So what this stigma does is it tells people who are living with HIV that they should not have pleasure. They should not connect to others in a way that they can love other people. And saying that even tells them that they should not love themselves. And for me, I think that this is an issue that it trickles down from like, it's a black and brown issue, right? It's the umbrella of what the issue is, but there's so many communities under that umbrella that it impacts. And what I say often is it feels like there's a racial there's a social profiling within the racial profiling that happens, right? So they put all black and brown people in this one bucket. And then among us, they're socializing how we live, how we love, right? And being that communities of color are disproportionately impacted by HIV, just like diabetes, just like hypertension, just like COVID, right? What happens is these policymakers and the people that are what I call in control of our local legislation, they are depending on us to have these conversations that negatively impact people who are living with HIV. And how they keep us from having positive conversations are these laws. As long as they criminalize people who are living with HIV, then the communities around them will have fear around HIV, right? Because there's nobody, most people in communities of color don't want to deal with the police and they don't want to deal with doctors or hospitals, right? And if you're talking about police and doctors and hospitals in one conversation and you're not alleviating the stress of communities of color, they're going to run. We as Black people have had years of medical mistrust because of the experiments done on Black bodies. So if any misinformation is put out about any type of health issue, then it will be perpetuated because sometimes as Black people or people of color, all we have is a shared knowledge, right? That is inherently, when we came to this country as people of color, that's all we had was a shared knowledge among each other. And that will always inherently be ours. So it's imperative that these lawmakers do not alter the lives and existence of people who are living with HIV, because it is a trickle down effect. It's just the stigma just perpetuates on its own because of the parameters in which we live.
I love that. I love, the frame of the structural impact, right, of the way that stigma creates a self-sustaining machine that is funded and fed by people that look like us because of, again, as you went to fear and I would even say historical and generational trauma, right? And it's easy to, I think about coming from South Asia and think about the way the colonization still lives on because people that look like me perpetuate because it's what gave them power over other people that look like them as well. And the ways that we, for sake of sense of control, even if it's false, create harm against others that are in our communities. I wanted to thank you. I'm really appreciating this conversation. I want to pull in Robert into this conversation. So thinking about your own faith journey and the way you've kind of addressed and advocated around policy work, etc., around HIV criminalization. Can you talk a little about the way your faith journey has influenced your advocacy against HIV criminalization?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a question I don't get asked a lot, but I'm practicing because as I am in a period of reflection right now, having gone through the advocacy and now it's like, what does this all mean? I realize my faith has really played a strong part for me because of one, the diagnosis. And as I said, I didn't know that I was at risk. And then two, the criminalization. And so giving me strength and some resilience to come through that, because and it's continued to be a long road. We're talking about stigma. To go even further, as if your race wasn't enough, or if the fact that HIV wasn't enough, or if you were, or your sexual orientation wasn't enough, or what do you choose to do with your body wasn't enough. They wanted to exploit the epidemic. And they've gone so far to some states to label you a sex offender, which is ridiculous, which is excessive, which is overkill, and which is not true. It's another lie, and it's just another way to control us. And so having to carry all of these labels as a Black gay man from the South, living with HIV, formerly incarcerated person, and now still on the sex offender registry in here in New York State. You need, I think, I think it was Lauren, one of you said you need something, you need some type of faith, something to hold, to ground you, because this is a lot. It is a lot to deal with. And a lot of it was things that I didn't think the world saw me in that way. And so it was definitely a wake-up call for me, because I had yet to experience some things. I wasn't out about my sexuality fully. I wasn't sharing that I was HIV positive with the masses, only with people that were close to me. And so when I was prosecuted, or when I was arrested, all of this came out. You know, many people have a coming out story. Well, mine is like a double boom, boom. Um, and so I think I thank my family for exposing me to faith, my grandparents for instilling so much in me, because this became what was my misery, and I understood it to be my ministry. I think someone alluded to that earlier. I think it's Jasmine. My pain, my misery was now my ministry, and it is what has pushed me, and I think it's what has kept me going to this day, because I recognize the lies, the injustice, the untruths. Um, and somebody has to tell, so somebody has to tell these stories, our stories. Somebody has to speak up and tell the truth in the face of people who claim to be Christian, claim to be loving and all these things, but it's just a lie, because obviously we're not serving or the same God, because one God is oppressive and the other one is about love and liberation and freedom. And but the bottom line is that you have to be able to stand for something. And I think my faith has really, it has compelled me to do this, where I am convinced there's no other arguments that can change my mind about the fact that we're on the right side of history to decriminalizing HIV. There's no argument. I know people come with all sorts of things. Well, what if this and what is it? What about my right this or right that? This issue is bigger than my experience. It's something much bigger, and that's another reason why I do this, because I recognize this is bigger than the situation between me and the person that accused me of exposing them to HIV. It's much bigger because it's impacting millions of people, and particularly Black and brown people, women, and obviously people that can be born with HIV who have no choice in these things. They're born with it. So, but yet they are confounded to laws that. And another thing I want to point out, we didn't create HIV. None of us created these things, and yet we are being punished for something we didn't create. We are living in this space. And so if the people who are supposed to be responsible for protecting us, for protecting public health and all these things, why are you allowing this to happen to us on one hand, and then you want to, on the other hand, criminalize us for it? It does not make sense, and you can't do both. You can't do prevention and criminalize us. It just does not make sense.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think that's exactly the point, right? The system is working exactly the way it was built, for the sake of harming communities and disrupting communities of color and folks who are with marginalized sexualities and people who are HIV positive, as this is creating us as the people who have these various marginalized identities as the boogie person, if you will, benefits upholding white supremacy, as folks talked about, and the ways that we the system. And I've, particularly in the last couple of weeks, I've had a lot of friends say, well, the system is broken. I'm like, actually, no, it's actually working at full speed exactly the way it was designed. And so how do we navigate that? And so Lauren, I want to bring you into the conversation, thinking about as a storyteller, as someone who kind of talks to a lot of people, particularly I want to bring in the elections as well, and kind of in the current political context of what the last 2 weeks have felt like and what may be coming in the next couple of years. How do we start to tell stories in ways that not only heard by people that all get it, that are in the panel today, but people kind of outside of our circles? And what is that? How do we, as storytellers in our own rights, take up that space and own the locus of control that we have?
Thank you so much, Raja, for that question. Number one, that's really great question. And I want to comment on something before I go into that. Earlier, Jasmine had said often the work that we do is not measured. And she went on to talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And because we're not always doing work out of grant funding, but doing work out of mere necessity and faith to do so. And so when I think about the climate of what's happening now, I wanted to say that data is not just numbers. And I think that our most valuable and important data is the lived experiences and stories of individuals within our communities. And I think those are the stories those are the data that's not always being tracked, right? So we rely on that quantitative data, and I think we have to rely on qualitative. Now, unfortunately, we're driven by numbers. And so I think about where we are today, and unfortunately, I think we saw that our society was driven by numbers that they see in their pockets, but not by the qualitative and the value of people's lives. And that's heartaching. It's heartaching. And so when I think about what tomorrow looks like and the mantle that's upon us and the responsibility that we have to create change, the first thing is we all should ask ourselves, if you're watching today and you sit on a board of an organization, or you have an interest in this work, or you're a student, or you're a medical professional, or whatever you do, the first thing I'm going to ask you is, what are you centering in your work? Are you centering the voices of your community in your work? That is what has to drive us forward, right? Let's stop centering the numbers, but center the people. And understanding that the audience that we speak to, I think this kind of relates in the faith community. I'll say this: in the Black church, you go into the Black church and we're always preaching, and hey, you got to get out there and you got to be a disciple and do this and do this. That's great. But we're preaching to each other. And the thing is you can get out there and you can bring the Bible to somebody, and you can share the Bible and you can share the word, but the Bible's for believers. And honestly, the word of God says people will know that you are mine by the love that you have for one another. By that, all men will know that you are mine. And so when I think about even like faith, get out of your community of faith. Where's the intersection of faith? Where are we coming together at lines of different faith communities, where we're coming together to solve the issues, to center voices? Because I guarantee you, when we get out of the comfort zones of what we deem or think is just the truth, there's something so much more beautiful when we pull back the layers and realize there's an intersection that we all meet at. And at that intersection, it's love. And when we meet there, we can find a lot of solutions. So anyone who's on today, who are you centering? What stories are you centering? You know, Jada talked about how policy is formed based on the stories and narratives that we're perpetuating. And yes, those stories, the narratives, they don't come from anywhere. In fact, like when we look at it, we know that from the beginning of time, it comes from that perpetuated stereotype that Black bodies are dangerous, Black bodies are a threat, right? That has perpetuated, I believe you were saying it, Jasmine, that's perpetuated through that kind of internalized racism. So then we're putting that back into our communities. We got to begin to like break all that down. We got to begin to have conversation. I live in Dallas. I never thought I would live back in Texas. Let me keep it very, very real. I lived in California for 14 years, and I'm like, I don't know why I chose to come back, but Anyway, that's another story, but there's a lot of beautiful things here, right? And one thing I do recognize, being in a city and state that weaponizes law on bodies, there is a necessity to disrupt that. And so how do we dig in with story to disrupt that? You know, Raja, I guess we just begin to tell them. And, you know, I think I have a saying with my organization, with my company, and our saying is, my voice, my story, my power. And so if you're not going to own your story, and that story might be, this is what I believe to be true. And then when you're exposed to truth, that breaks down. And so then you get to the authenticity of of who you really are, right? And then that is what can drive you forward. So I think it's telling our stories, and then it's exposing what is incorrect and the lies that are perpetuated within our communities of faith, and then finding the intersection where we can all meet. Because like I said, storytelling is education, but education has the power to fail us, divide us, or it can aid in our liberation. And so we have to choose. We have to choose what it's going to be.
Right. So I heard you talk about kind of educating our own communities, telling our stories, going outside of our faith communities, and finding that intersection, finding that kind of shared common denominator, or like, why are we engaged in this work, and what that means. I saw a lot of heads nodding as well. If I'm correct, I think all four of our panelists are also mostly in the South. And I also wonder like how that specifically uniquely shapes the way we think about this work, and the East Coast, and I'm on the West Coast. And so I think it's interesting, right, across the nation, how even the local and the national context are actually some often mirrored in the way we think about this work. I want to pull in Jada as well to think about, as we think about policy level work. And I think Lauren talked about kind of the individual faith communities and storytelling. Particularly given kind of the current state of the US and politics, what are we need to be thinking about as we start to think, what are you maybe concerned about? Maybe that's a better question as we go forward.
Unfortunately, I feel like there's so much to be concerned about. You know, for starters, I think it's interesting that we're probably going to see a lot of cuts to necessary programs that are needed by people who not only are more vulnerable to HIV, but more vulnerable to HIV criminalization as well. Right, I forget, one of my panelists was saying this. It's like, we know that Black and Brown communities have a higher prevalence of HIV, and they're facing higher criminalization rates at the same time as well. So it's just a cycle that feeds into each other. So I think when we see program and funding cuts, right, how are we going to end the HIV epidemic if we're going to be cutting funds for testing or preventative care? If we are going to be getting rid of the Affordable Care Act and people aren't going to have health insurance, how are they going to access preventative treatment? How are they going to feel about going and getting tested and seeking counseling? So we're literally undermining the very efforts to end the HIV epidemic as a whole. So I think we will see a lot of that, but I think we're going to be on the defense a lot as well, right? Like, our lives and liberty are at stake. And so we're going to be fighting anti-trans legislation, anti-gender affirming care legislation. I'm sure there will even be anti-mask legislation, something as simple as that, right? I think we've got a lot of batten down the hatches, and we're just going to power through and make it. But at the same time, I think this is now a time for education. So a lot of the coalitions that I'm working, that CHLP is working with and that I'm involved with, are going to be focusing on education. And how do we continue to educate people, even if we can't necessarily move the needle with legislation right now? And so I think that's huge as well. But, you know, I'm I'm curious to see what happens to some of these federal organizations under the new administration, and what happens in terms of they may still exist, but they're not funded to do their work, or they're not actually staffed to do their work. And so I think that is something that we're definitely worried about, especially when it felt like we were gaining such momentum. And so one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that there's been a lot of movement with attacking HIV criminalization and using the American with Disabilities Act. And so I think sometimes when people think about legislation, and they don't necessarily think about also using the courts in order to get case precedent to say that a state law is discriminatory. So we've done that in Tennessee, but with this new round of elections and with judicial appointees, the makeup of the court is going to shift. And so a strategy that was working, I'm not sure is going to be utilized in the future based on the makeup of who is holding a judicial seat. So it goes all the way down from the federal level, it goes to your courthouse. And so I think that that's another thing to note. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty that we're trying to navigate, like, how do we do that? How do we do our work? How do we make it so that we're not just on the defensive, but we're still being proactive as well? And it's something that I know my org is grappling with and having conversations about as well, how best to approach the shifting political climate with the work that we do and still keep our message the same, right? And I think that's another big piece of our work is like, I'm not watering myself down. Our org shouldn't have to water our message down, right? Under the last administration, like you weren't allowed to say equity. I don't know how you do this work and you don't say the word equity. And so I think there's going to be a lot of like standing firm and standing 10 toes down and like what we've said about ourselves and our community and making sure that we reaffirm those messages as well.
Thank you. You hit on so many good points. I want to bring in some other folks too. And I want to just add in, I was having this really fascinating conversation about preemptive obedience and how people are already shifting organizational value to like in fear of what might happen if you have a particular value or a particular framework, particular practice or policy, and often how that's giving up power as organizations and what it means to actually hold true to your values. I think what you just talked about, Jada, and wait till we're forced to change versus changing for fear of being attacked, which often then makes us even less powerful because we're not even waiting for the attack, we're just giving it up. And so I wonder how that lays into this practice. You also talked a lot about how HIV policy and all these other frameworks are so interconnected, particularly around policy. And one thing that I remember I teach a lot about, and one of the reasons I started to talk about HIV in a academic context was because HIV, particularly as a pandemic, and became such a fascinating framework to look at the ways that inequities manifest itself through race, class, gender, ability, access, immigration, etc. Like you can look at the ways that HIV laws and practice and policies have been shaped and who gets harmed are often also the same folks that are harmed and all the other intersection of identities and the ways that it's seen as this public health framework to harm people that quote unquote people don't want in particular places or spaces, and how that harms it, whether it's being on sex offender lists or other spaces. And you know, I want to pull in Robert as well to talk about kind of this impact of criminalization on kind of pleasure and queerness and kind of identity and what it means to be a queer person, particularly a queer Black person in the space, and how that's impacted you and how you show up in that place.
I have to tell you, I was a bit nervous when I first decided to speak out because I wasn't sure how the queer community or even the HIV community was going to perceive me. I didn't really know anybody living with HIV, like in meaningful way. So I really didn't know just how to be in terms of knowing how someone would react to me. And so but good thing is that I felt embraced. I felt the communities embraced me, which I was happy for that because, again, I recognize that this issue is bigger than my situation. And so it's something that people really need to take seriously and really need to understand, because we're fighting against each other. We're attacking each other where we should be supporting each other. Um, and I just feel like maybe many people don't understand not so much what it means to live with HIV, but understand the environment in which all of this stuff exists, right? And so we're just reacting to it. And so, so it is part of my mission, hopefully, that I feel like I've touched quite a few people, but there's still more, because there's still people who may 10 years from now were much younger and now they're here today. And so these people need to be educated and informed, just as well as the folks who've been here a while, you know. So it has been one of my priorities is to get in those spaces, in the queer spaces, the Black gay queer spaces particularly, to share about my lived experience as a gay man and as someone living with HIV and navigating those relationships. Because it's how it's happened to me. And I want them to understand that I understand the fear, I understand the messiness of this, but you really need to understand the truth in which how we're being perceived. Because you, as a citizen, may feel some kind of way, you got some rights, but really with these laws, the way they're being enforced and how white supremacy looks at us through these various lenses, they're not on our side. They are not on our side. So you may be thinking that you are, you know, you're good, you're upstanding and what have you, law abiding. I thought the same thing too, until it happened to me. And so it is so important that I feel like I hope that they take what I've done to heart, take it seriously, because your life can change. It doesn't take much. Your life can change from a diagnosis as well as to a criminalization experience. It does not take much because it is set up that way. It's intentional. And that's why understanding our history is so important. HIV just happened to happen, just like COVID did. People were living their lives, being liberated and having an AIDS happen, and lives were changed. And so there's been a lot of exploitation going on there. Criminalizing health status is not new. Again, we didn't create HIV. We just happen to be impacted by it. And so it's so important that I say all this, that we have to pay attention to all these different things and understanding our history, understanding where we come from, because we were criminalized for being gay, and then that stopped. But then HIV happened. There's like, oh, well, this is another way that we can use to criminalize people, to control them. And so I just really have been trying to get that message out to the queer community, the Black queer community, because this is, it's about us. So we should be paying very close attention.
Thank you. That willingness and taking time to invest in community spaces and in these conversations, right? Because I think often the fear required makes it easy for us to just disconnect and just kind of shut down, or create little in-source spaces, and how does that maybe harm us? I think I'd love to bring in Jasmine as well. Why is it for you to serve? Why is it important for you to serve as a representation of trans women who practice faith and spirituality in your personal life and community, as we think about HIV and stigma and the ways that communities, particularly trans women of color, have been portrayed in our culture?
I think it's really important, and it kind of goes to what Jada said. Well, I don't know if it was Jada or Lauren. Y'all have been dropping gems. Like, everybody's been so good. I'm just like doodling, taking notes. But we as people of color in marginalized communities have experienced a terrible administration more than we have experienced a good administration when it comes to the presidency. So although this looks very bad right now, we will be okay. I think what we have to do is, like Jada said, we're going to do a lot of fighting, which we have been doing, right? And as people who live in southern states, child, even if Kamala had been in office, we still would have been doing some fighting in our local legislations, right? And what I say, and I have a couple of notes, what I say is this election to me was a big screw you to women. They wanted to double down to us as women that we didn't want you the last time and we don't want you this time. And I fear that trans people, LGBTQIA identified people, and even cis women will now be more fearful of holding elected officials accountable because we don't feel accepted or seen in these spaces. And the representation that is there has been altered and tainted by white supremacists and capitalists. And you know, it's important for me to serve as representation to show people, no, baby, we still got to be out here. We got to be in the trenches, you know. And I often say, even as organizations, sometimes these organizations lose funding because here's this the church girl to me. This may not even be about this. This is old Baptist church girl to me. You do wrong, wrong follow. Some of these organizations and stuff that are experiencing the loss of funding is because they wasn't doing what they were supposed to be doing with it when they were getting it. Now, yes, is it their governor that's stopping from getting it? Maybe so. But did they need to get it? Not all of them needed to get it. And maybe they just needed a wake-up call. But like, we have to also hold the people in our communities who are supposed to be doing this work with us. We have to hold them accountable as well, because if someone is silent during this time, they are aligning with all of the things that we find to be problematic. So even if they're in community, just working at an organization is not enough. Just sitting and existing is not enough. We need people to fight. And that's why I'm here. And that's why it's important for me to be a representation for my community, because I need my sisters to fight.
Oh, I love it. Preach, Reverend Tasaki. There you go. I appreciate it. We're going to start to move into some questions. We have a couple of questions to get to, and then we'll have so if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A section, please, so that we can answer them. I'll throw it to the whole group and see whoever wants to answer. The first question is, as someone born with HIV and the stigma of criminalization has made fear a factor in my life, how do we start the conversation and change the laws and policies?
Yeah, I think, well, depending on where you are, it's been started. You know, I always encourage anyone to research and look out if there's a local coalition doing that work, to get involved with that work. Because really where it starts are conversations like this, right? With educating. So often I go into spaces and I hear people say, like, I had no idea that people living with HIV could face prosecution in this way. I didn't know that these criminal laws existed. So even just having conversations like this, where we're raising awareness, to me, that is one step towards decrim. It all starts with that baby step of education. And so I would say definitely getting involved in coalition. If there isn't a coalition in your state, you know, is that something that you want to be a part of building from the ground up? There are ways also to get involved in this advocacy at a level where maybe you join an established group and learn from them. Like CERO has a ton of opportunities for individuals to get education and training as well, including their big conference, HINAC, to train advocates how to engage in this work. And so I think I would say that's probably like the easiest route to try and get in to start trying to change these laws, is to get in with the coalition and actively engage in the work. We need advocates of lived experience. People with lived experience should be the ones leading this movement and leading the work. And also, like, looking for jobs and paid opportunities in the nonprofit space. I would say, like, please, if that's something that you're interested in, where you feel like you want to be an organizer, I think people should be paid for their time and their efforts. I get that it is a personal cause for some, but I do believe that we should all be paid for our work. So I think looking for different, like, speaking opportunities, there are roles that are open for coordinators, and being able to get your foot in the door that way as well. So I would say just having these conversations is like 101 of how we start and get on a path to changing these laws. I'm sure others may have more that they want to add on to that.
I just put a little note in the chat box. I wasn't going to verbally say, but I kind of want to give context. because we all use language differently. But what I find is that a lot of the stigma is wrapped in the language that we use, and sometimes we think we're using the right language. And guess what? The language has changed. It's gotten even more inclusive. So we're always using the right language. But I will pose the one I put in the chat just says people of color are vulnerable to HIV rather than at risk for HIV. And it's really important that we learn that using that term is crucial, because if we're at risk for HIV, because that ultimately says our race puts us at risk, right? So the being vulnerable is a better word. So I would say, yes, have those conversations like Jada said, but like before you go to your specific community, talk to yourself with some of these about some of this, like reading it and talking back with yourself, or maybe checking with 2 or 3 people and finding out what language is best for your community. Because what works for me, right, may not necessarily work. I mean, what works in Memphis may not necessarily work in New York. What works in New York may not necessarily work in Louisiana. So like finding out what your community finds to be relatable and what they can resonate with is key in starting those conversations, because just having the conversation is what is actually dangerous. That's where stigma seeps in it. So we have to have control of the narrative when we're having.
Yeah, I would just add, it's really important, as Jasmine mentioned, that you do sit with yourself and really read and get as much understanding as you possibly can. And then where you may have questions, then reach out to someone that is more knowledgeable, that can help you sort of brainstorm and process through what the text and language means. But it really is something that people really need to sit down with themselves and come to their own, some level of understanding for themselves, and not feed your understanding based off fears and misinformation from other people who don't otherwise know what they're talking about. And so, so if you are that person that really cares about this issue, that's really interesting to you, I encourage you to read, because that's how I've learned. I did a lot of reading, and it takes a while. It takes a while to get it to sink in, because it's so complex, so nuanced. And so that's why it's important for you to sit with it and then reach out to get a little bit more understanding from people who can help support your learning.
I was just going to say, I put some language guides in the chat. One is geared technically towards media, but I think it's still useful and talks about person first language. They're from Equality Federation and PWN. And so I encourage people to just check them out. Because Jasmine, you're right, and language is always evolving. And sometimes, honestly, like on a sleepless night, I'm like, wait, did I say the wrong word that I like? Because a year ago, that's what we used to say. Like now we don't say that. Like you were just talking, I was like, oh my God, did I say at risk instead of vulnerable? So like checking yourself too when it happens, because it happens. I think that's part of like when language evolves, sometimes you will slip up and you might say the wrong thing, and checking yourself like, yes, okay, it's vulnerable to instead of at risk. So I think it's important to just kind of stay up to date as much as you can. And community members will let you know, as well as like there are great resources and guides too.
Lauren, were you going to add something?
I was just going to say, because I love that Jasmine and Jada just brought that up. I was also going to say, when we're having these conversations and someone might utilize language that could be harmful or offensive simply because they don't know, to also give grace in the correction of it, right? Because that could be the thing that stops them from having further conversation with someone else. So how do we offer that grace and say, oh my gosh, I love that you want to have this conversation. We should reframe that word, or however you choose to say it, but think of a way that is inviting people into the conversation. We say the church doors are open, but they're not really, they're often shut. So where are we inviting everyone in?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, what I hear from all 4 of you is that like social change happens at various levels, right? There's an individual level where we have to do our own work. We have to really ask those tough questions that Robert talked about, of like, what exactly do I want to happen? What does that look like? And then I think we think about the interpersonal. I think Jasmine talked about like, where am I taking up space? Where am I showing up? And why is it important for me to share in the world? And I think what Jada and Lauren have talked about is like, and then as we think about the intersections and interactions of people, how are we cultivating a space for learning and growing? And I think, Lauren, you talk about like, I'm always learning. It's like, as teacher learners, as Paulo Freire would say, we all have responsibilities to teach and learn. And if we can't do both, we're not actually doing either. And so how do we hold that humility in that space? And finally, the institutional or kind of societal level of like, how are we then utilizing our personal experiences and then our relationships and the communities that we're connecting and learning and engaging with? How do we then take up space in this larger space, think about how do we influence policies and practices, et cetera? And so I wanted to, we have about 15 minutes left now, about 10 minutes left actually. So I wanted to see if we could maybe jump in and see if any of you are comfortable talking about how the science is involved and supports decriminalization, particularly think about U equals U, undetectable equals untransmissible, and viral suppression, and the importance of people knowing their status because treatment is prevention, and how HIV criminalization discourages people from actually knowing their status. I know it's a lot in there, but I think it's in the text box. If you could, anyone wants to respond, I'll put in Jasmine.
So I'll talk a little bit about, because it actually ties into some stuff I wrote down that I didn't say. So science does not support decrim, or else we wouldn't be here, because science has shown us for the last at least 15 to 20 years, right, that if people are undetectable or if people are virally suppressed, they're less likely to transmit HIV to someone else. We also know that PrEP, depending on where you live, has been in existence for about 10 years, 10 to 15 years. But what we see is that it is the messaging that divides people from viral suppression, right? What messages they receive and what do they retain. And I feel like there's a control of population that is happening, right? When we look at the policing of Black bodies or bodies of color, it happens through HIV and through drugs, right? They criminalize us for things that we are vulnerable to, that are beyond our control. So it's a way to control our population and how we will create more Black and brown bodies. So I think that it is an intention of white supremacy that science does not inform these laws. And I love that Jada spoke earlier about the lack of intent when it comes to HIV criminalization laws. Some of them are so crazy. I live in a city where if you spit on somebody, it is like you're out of there, right? And it all feeds and funnels into like why we can't have conversations about our status. So not only do people who are living with HIV feel fear because of these laws, but those who are, and when I say impacted by HIV, that is any Black or brown person that is in existence, because we are all vulnerable to HIV, and we 9 times out of 10 know someone who is living with HIV or who has lived with HIV. And those conversations are not easy to have because of the fear that the laws, put into people's hearts and their bodies. And I think that people who are living with HIV are actually not as fearful. It places more fear on those people who know nothing about HIV. And it keeps them from wanting to even test. There are people that know people living with HIV. There are people that love people. There are people that love people living with HIV. There are people that work in the field of HIV that do not get tested like they should, that are fearful. And we find that people still acquire HIV that have all of the knowledge they need. And I feel that the root of that is stigma and how people are perceived. And the very people that work in this field feel like they can't go where they work to get tested because they don't want to be talked about. So we have to really look at those conversations. We use the term, let's have conversations, let's start conversations. Those conversations have to be guided and rooted in not only science, but good intentions, because oftentimes science leads to more division. I'll just bring this term up and then I'll be quiet. When we think about molecular surveillance, right? That creates a level of fear for people who are living with HIV, because now not only is it against the law to be living with HIV, but it is scientifically surveilled who you slept with, how it was like these things begin to, what is supposed to protect us actually divides us. And it gets scary for people who are living with HIV.
Yeah. Yeah. Robert.
Oh, I just want to emphasize that it is a new day for people who are not knowledgeable about HIV. And even for those that are, you know, U equals U, the treatment works. I've been living with HIV for 21 years and I've not had one complication as far as my health is concerned. My complication has been more dealing with the criminalization of HIV. That has been my biggest problem of 21 years of living with this virus. But what I want people that are not living with HIV to know is that there is work for you to do. There is work, there's treatment that is available for you, for those that do not want to contract or live with HIV. It is there for you. You need to get educated, learn it, grab it, hold on to it, and help other people learn about it. Because people live with HIV, some of us are doing both. We're doing work to prevent folks from getting HIV, and we're doing work to make sure that we have the treatment and access that we need. And it's tiring. It's really tiring. And so there's enough work here for everybody to do, because I think sometimes we get on these calls and people think, oh, well, they're just talking about people living with HIV. No, we're talking about you too. This applies to any and everybody. So if you had not made that connection yet, I'm here to let you know that if you are not living with HIV, there is work for you to do under U equals U. There's treatment available for you so that you are not, so that your life is not changed by this. So I just hope that you go out and seek that information just as well as you also learn about HIV and HIV criminalization.
Thank you. It's interesting, right, to think about how access to PrEP and PEP, et cetera, kind of as a way to make sure that, you know, people don't become HIV positive. And and yet at the same time also has both kind of reduced the responsibility of people who are not living with HIV to be like they don't have responsibility to do anything about it because people with HIV have medication, and yet that you because you, but it also has created this re-stigmatized people living with HIV, at least on some of the social media. So I've talked about like how people avoid people or avoid sharing HIV status or et cetera. And so how this I think you both named this beautiful complexity of how do we all take responsibility, understanding the biological kind of evolution of medication is there, and yet it takes all of us to actually stop this virus from spreading, and requires us to also undo the stigma that forces people to not know their status or take medication or take responsibility for sharing with their partners, and also challenging their policymakers to create policies that feel more inclusive. We have a couple more minutes left, so I wanted to bring in, let's see, Lauren, I'm going to ask you if you want to quickly talk about your documentary and kind of how that addresses formerly incarcerated citizens and reentry and how that may impact people's HIV status and sharing and community access, especially if they're required to be in sex offender lists, et cetera. And then I'm going to just throw the other question out, and anyone who wants to answer can do that as well for sake of time. Regarding language, how do you feel about the term, quote, status neutral? Is there a concern we are not acknowledging people with HIV by being neutral?
So I'll jump in here really quick. My documentary is called Redemption Scholars, and it's really examining the liberation of education, but also how education divides us and fails us. And this is a story following 3 men and other individuals who were formerly incarcerated in their journey of higher education while they were inside. When I started working on this project, I've come across many different scholars and individuals who have spent time inside, but I want to give a quote that one of the men in my film said, and he himself is not living with HIV, but he said, I saw many of my brothers come inside with time on their record. And the moment they entered the prison cells, they were given a life sentence. He was talking about individuals. So when you come into prison, the first thing they do, they strip you, right? You come in, they test you. And you're given a slip, he would say, and everyone knew when a person was given a certain color slip and the prison he was in, they knew that that person was living with HIV. Now that person, that might have been the first time that they found that out. It might not have been the first time they found that out. They might have known that. And those individuals are then kept in isolation, oftentimes for weeks at a time, as if living with HIV becomes an airborne virus. And so the life sentence part comes into effect because oftentimes inside our most vulnerable population, our brothers and sisters who are behind bars, are not getting the proper medications that they need. And I heard this in stories over and over again. They're sometimes giving medications that are outdated, that shouldn't be given to individuals anymore. And so they're not only vulnerable because they are Black or brown, but because they are inside where they're often forgotten. And these are forgotten stories and individuals. And you see this then played out when individuals do get the opportunity to return home, when integrating back into society, not given all the resources they need. Now, I will say there are some wonderful organizations that are doing that work, that are providing help with reentry, specifically for individuals too who are living with HIV. I know like Hyacinth, which is based out of New Jersey, is doing a lot of work with reentry. And so finding those organizations and finding ways that you can also get involved is really important. But I think that it's important. Jasmine, you were talking a lot about vulnerability, and we're all vulnerable just by being in Black and brown bodies or being a woman. And so I think when we think about our most vulnerable, right, those are often those who are forgotten and are not also deemed a part of society. Because even when you come home, you are still property of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And so that property piece, right? That's why we are where we're here today talking about this epidemic, right? Because it's our bodies are this property. I'm done.
Thank you. No, thank you. And Jasmine answered the question around stuff neutral. If other folks have anything, you can add that into a closing comment. And I think Lauren, a couple of folks asked about where they can potentially catch the film. So if you want to respond in the chat box, that'd be great. We're about 2 minutes before we have to wrap up. So we have a couple of quick announcements at the end. I wanted to say folks want to just maybe take 30 seconds to offer one thing that people on this panel can do, or sorry, people in this audience can do. And as some of you have talked about already, or any other closing words that you'd like to share. Just about 30 seconds per person. I'm just going to go through my list. I'm going to go backwards in order. I'll start with Robert and then end with Jada. I'm going to invite Robert to come on in.
Oh, yeah. I just encourage people again to just seek out this information. I want to do a shameless plug for a colleague about his book, Criminalized Lives, HIV and Legal Violence, if you want to know about more experiences of people living with HIV. Also, you can go to the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. There's stories there of those of us that have been impacted, but we're part of the Council of Justice Leaders, and we're sharing our stories. So you can find our stories there on the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation website. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you be able to pop the book link into the chat box as well? Thank you. Jasmine.
Hey, I'm going to do 2 really quick plugs. As you all know, I'm the executive director of 2 amazing organizations. And I love that Lauren brought up currently incarcerated people or newly re-entering society. That is the work that we do at Black and Pink. We are dedicated to the liberation of LGBTQIA people who are currently incarcerated or newly re-entering society. We offer housing for those people living with HIV coming out of jails and prisons. And I would love for you all to find out more about Black and Pink at blackandpink.org. We are blasting out our Giving Tuesday for our Black and brown trans folks who are currently incarcerated. We want to see them thrive. And I also think it's important for us to remember that not only are people divided and lost from their families through the violence of separation when they're incarcerated, they are also forgotten to be people who love pleasure as well. And sex happens in jails. We need to put condoms into jails because it's going to happen. Thank you so much, everybody, for having me.
Thank you, Jasmine. Lauren?
So I posted over in the chat. You can find out more about my work and the work that we're doing at authenticvoicesglobal.com. The documentary Redemption Scholars is one of the projects that we're currently working on, and then doing amplification with organizations and helping them to amplify their stories, because I just find that it's very, very important in stories in our community as well. It's a pleasure to be on here. And I just, once again, I leave everyone with one thing. What are the stories you're telling? Whose voices are you centering? And if you don't know, go find out, right? So make sure that you're leading from truth. The only way to rewrite the narrative is you have to be in a place of constantly learning. There's two definitions. Redemption, for my documentary, redemption means it is not only righting one's wrongs, but it's also a change in perspective and the way that we see one another. That is how we define redemption. So how are you changing your perspective? So question yourself on how you see those around you. And then scholar, we define scholar as someone who is smart enough to know that they don't know everything. So whatever you don't know, it is your responsibility to get out there and learn it, because if you don't, you're only perpetuating a false narrative.
Thank you, Lauren. Jada.
Yeah, if I had to leave with just one thing, is that the work doesn't stop, right? It doesn't matter if there's a different administration. It really doesn't matter. Outside factors, like the work continues, people's lives are still affected. We have to keep up education efforts, and we have to take care of ourselves in the process. So I think something that's always important about this work is, like, we all give of ourselves so much, right? That we also need to take care of ourselves so that we can do this work, and whatever that looks like as well. So make sure to, like, guard your peace so that you can continue to be a good advocate, so that you can continue in the fight. So that would be the last message that I guess I would like to send.
Thank you. Robert, Jasmine, Lauren, Jada, you have just enlightened my life today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your story, your light, your space, your us creating this collective narrative of why and how we do the work, and we continue to show up every day, because this is the way we reduce stigma. This is the way we use our faith to light the way to our collective liberation. I'm truly grateful, honored to be a part of this space. I want to just quickly invite Reverend Mike to come on in. I know we're just at the hour, to just share a little bit more about the U.S. HIV/AIDS Faith Coalition, and give you some links as well.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for being part of the webinar today. And so grateful to all of our speakers for their excellent presentations, and the conversation was really enlightening. So the U.S. HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition's been around since around 2014, and we've been part of this International Conference on Stigma for quite a number of years now as well. It's a privilege to be part of this. We're grateful to be invited. I did put in the chat ways in which you can stay in touch with the U.S. HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition and our work. We are a coalition of faith leaders who are concerned about how the faith role in HIV response can be expanded. We're working to move faith forward so that we can achieve the goal of ending the HIV and AIDS epidemic by 2030. And we're committed to helping faith leaders and faith communities and those who are interested in working in partnership with faith entities to do that work well and to do it effectively. And so we hope that you'll engage with us. Please try to subscribe. You'll see a link to subscribing to our email newsletter where you'll hear about events that are coming up. You can also be in touch with us through email, through our YouTube channel. There's a variety of videos from various webinars and events that we've done, including the work at the U.S. HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition, where we host a day-long pre-conference to the U.S. Conference on AIDS. We also are very active on Facebook, and that's where we post most of our most current information about what's happening in the life of the organization. Once again, thanks everyone for your great work and for being part of the webinar today.
Thank you, Reverend Mike. Gratitude to all of you, blessings to all of you. May you continue to enjoy the conference and continue to engage in this dialogue as we all become part of the change we wish to see in the world. Thank you.